You've all been muted. You're mute, Amit. You're mute.
So you're on mute.
I think you're mute. Amit ji, आप mute पे हैं.
Good afternoon. I welcome all of you who've joined in and dialed in for the event this afternoon. I'd also take this opportunity to welcome both Neeraj and Deepak, who will be shortly speaking to you. I'm quite excited about this event, and I remember many years ago we had meetings with IFC, and then we were talking to BSC, and then as a consequence of that, BSC brought in a lot of companies into the room, and we kind of started talking about something like governance scores. And at that time, of course, it seemed like the holy grail. People asked us that, look, this is something so fuzzy. How can you actually put a number to it? But I'm quite happy to say that, look, we did that we developed the scorecard over 2 years, 2015, 16, and since then it's been constantly in use, and it's kind of served its purpose reasonably well. So anything to talk about it, announce the scores. This is what we're going to do today, announce the findings when we are looking at the scores, is something which keeps us occupied, not just during the 2 or 3 months before the score, but also throughout the year as we think about what's going on. Coming to things this year itself, 2020 and 2021, the headlines have been dominated by the pandemic. The world has learned that continued waves of the pandemic are difficult to predict, and the new normal must incorporate the impact of such ambiguity. However, I'm quite happy to say that this hasn't dented the confidence of corporate India. Indeed, in fact, if you think about it, the slew of IPOs that launched in the midst of the pandemic, the capital raise which happened, the capital expenditure which is lined up for the next few years, signal that corporate India has taken this resulting uncertainty in its stride. Notwithstanding concerns on the pandemic's financial and social impact, they do continue to weigh on managements and boards. Corporate India realizes they're not likely to dissipate soon, and therefore it's best to kind of deal with it. And I guess the best way to deal with it is to keep focusing on steadily improving your governance processes and practices. And that is something which stands out as we've done the analysis during the year. With that, you have to recognize that there's a growing awareness of investor expectations around governance, which companies will have to pay heed to. And what it means is they'll have to look at their governance structures and their processes even much more closely. And this is there because not just because of the uncertainty, but also because if you've seen several instances of investor activism, while we've seen some of it happening even before, I think what is happening is now that investors are far more vocal than they were 3 years or 5 years or 7 years ago. So that's a big change. And there are more instances of direct activism which investors are displaying. And along with that, if you kind of look at, forget the fact that just look at how investors are voting, there are a slew of resolutions where investor dissent is very high. In fact, majority of the ESOP resolutions had more than 25% of the institutional shareholders voting against. Something like related party transactions, you've got a slew of institutional investors voting against. You look at independent directors, some of them have some very high profile and marquee names have been voted out. You look at compensation, again, you see the same thing. And therefore, what it means is that companies need to be very clear about what they're doing, why they're doing it, and communicate it in an effective manner. And that this job is not going to become easier because earlier this year or earlier last year, SEBI has asked all mutual funds to start voting on all resolutions. So therefore, if earlier mutual funds were abstaining, they don't have that luxury going forward. There are other aspects of the pandemic, some of which most of which I would say are well reported. One is the changes to workforce behavior. Uh, Forget others. We look at our organization where employees want us to continue with a hybrid model of working. So it's kind of forcing us, and I'm sure like us, it's forcing a lot of other companies to rethink their work paradigm. Uh, the big conversation at boards has been two things which have happened simultaneously, which is their headcount reductions, people are resigning, companies are letting people go, but at the same time, they're finding it very difficult to recruit new people. So therefore, HR, which was always important for the board, has suddenly become front and center. Of course, at the beginning, there was supply chain disruptions. Some of them have continued. Some of those companies have kind of managed, but there is still some shortage of components, particularly when you think about the transportation sector, etc. And as along with all this, we find that companies have kind of started thinking about ESG, and boards will have to push much more on the agenda. And later today, after Hetal presents the findings, we will have a discussion in terms of how boards are thinking about ESG and what is the conversation on the boards around this. Perhaps not surprisingly, our analysis this year also points to a strong correlation between the quality of the board, and that actually translates into an increase in governance scores over the past year. While we've kind of seen it in most years, I think it's much, much more stark this year, where the external challenges which the companies faced have been more pronounced. And I guess the outcome is pretty clear. In the midst of the pandemic and related uncertainties, companies with stronger boards will thrive. They are the ones who will prosper and create the highest shareholder value. And again, thoughtful and forward-looking boards with independent thinking, diversity of thoughts, and agility are the ones that will propel their companies ahead of the others. So with those opening comments, let me first very quickly thank Neeraj. They've been huge supporters of the governance scorecard right from when it was first thought about in 2015-16, and they've been with us throughout this whole period. I'll request Neeraj to make a few opening comments regarding the scorecard and BSE's involvement with the scorecard. Neeraj, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Amit. I think it's a pleasure to be back again with these scorecards for 2021. And it's a long association, I guess, from 15-16, as you rightly said. And it's something which we have always believed in. And the good part here has been that, when this was originally thought about, the angle of the thought was primarily investors. And that's where, there was a huge support which also came in from the IFC. Because as international investors, what is the criteria that investors look at is when investing in countries like India was an important input which was sought from them. And then this whole exercise started, and it went through several iterations. And IiAS has really done a great job since then of yearly, every year they go through this whole list, do a very detailed analysis. So it's been, I think, a wonderful thing, because see, one of the most important things as an exchange for us is that we are in the business of trust, and trust implies that how do the investors come to know or have a good idea about the company in which they can invest in. If the investors do not have an idea, then there will always be some challenges or the other. And in that direction, I mean, also we are thankful to SEBI, because regulations for corporate governance is not an easy job. Typically, there will be very few regulations internationally, but in India, the regulator has wisely worked with corporate sector to essentially nudge, and that's how it started. And they eventually, over a period of time, there have been multiple committees. The last being the Kotak Committee, which has provided a lot of recommendations. And I guess all this is towards rebuilding the trust in companies and towards more transparency, towards informing stakeholders, keeping the stakeholders informed, and to ensure equitable rights to the and treatment to the shareholders. So, and so this is at least the thematically the regulator has tried to do its best. And of course, it takes time. But with the corporate involvement, we have also reached some distance. At least, we can say that. Having said that, there are also challenges. I mean, corporate governance issues are being extremely highlighted now. And several institutions and corporates, etc., across for the last several years, we have been hearing, we continue to hear a lot of news about issues relating to corporate governance across organizations. So effectiveness of the boards is a very important thing that's also come about. And as has already been mentioned by Amit, issues like shareholder activism and separately whistleblowers, etc. And we cannot forget the role of social media. Companies have to be aware that today social media plays such an important role in the lives of people, and any information is out there instantaneously. And so that is a challenge, as well as that also ensures that there's much more discipline across organizations. And then ESG activism is certainly an important area, as has already been mentioned by Amit. But over and above that, there are also the positive side is that proxy advisory firms have also gained a lot of importance. So, when you look at it in a wholesome manner, the regulator prescribing guidelines to the extent up to the limit of how many meetings an independent director, how many boards can an independent director join. Yes, they may be slightly prescriptive, but this nation works on prescription, and sometimes it helps, and it does lead somewhere. I mean, that's the way I look at it. And hopefully, with all this in totality, we have reached some place, and which is what is reflected in what IiAS and this whole scorecard eventually will present. So I must congratulate Amit for the wonderful work they have been doing till now, and also will continue to be doing, and we will certainly like to be associated with it, because from our perspective, it gives us, it's like a pulse, it's like a barometer of what's happening in corporate governance, because that ties up to the business we are in, which is the business of trust. So I'll end there, and thank you very much for providing me this opportunity. I think it's been wonderful to be associated with this. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Neerajji. I don't think I could have said it any better, that it's the barometer, it's the pulse, which we are holding up to corporate India to tell them about what is happening with regard to the governance practices. With these words, let me kind of welcome Deepak Bagla to come and give you the keynote address. Deepak is the CEO of Invest India. So if you kind of, while there's a lot of buzz about what's happening in startup India, what's happening with the unicorns, etc., how the regulations are slowly getting tweaked around. Why is the government today a lot more company and investor friendly than it has been any time in the past? We have Deepak to thank for a lot of those initiatives and tweaks and ease of doing business which is happening. And therefore, I thought it's just appropriate to have him come and give his keynote and talk about his thoughts on the governance and the Indian business landscape. With that, let me hand it over to you, Deepak.
Thank you, Amit. Thank you very much. Let me first start by complimenting you, Hetal, and the entire team, and also thanking you, complimenting you because what you've created as a platform, it's now 6 years, and it is something which you're doing, which is center of the plate to something which I'm doing. And this entire effort, and Neeraj put it very well, this is the business of trust and credibility. And you are a strong pillar of that trust and credibility and the perception and the creation of the trust and credibility. And frankly, the stronger we create your pillar, the easier my job begins, which is to get investment and make India the most preferred investment destination on the planet. A lot has happened in this. Neeraj mentioned about the committees which had been set up. I remember we started in the 80s with Mr. Damodaran heading a committee which was out of FICCI, and that was on the independent directors. And right through, I mean, a number of reiterations have happened, a lot of effort has gone in, a lot of work has happened in this. And we are seeing the results of that. India is moving up. For example, you are now rated amongst the top countries in the world, especially where small shareholder interest monitoring is concerned and protection. You're right up there. And that is something which we showcase even on our charts when we are showcasing the opportunity in India. It's huge, and it really has a very strong impact on the global investing community. I must compliment you on that. So this work is very, very important. And I also like the framework which you've created. You followed the OECD G20 principles, but it's a very comprehensive framework, and it also goes into a greater depth than even what they are doing. And you brought in all the stakeholders, which is very critical. So this report, I think we are all looking forward to what are the results you've come up with this year. And I'm sure we are seeing a trend which is moving up. But I must also say a lot more needs to be done in this sphere. And I think it will be one of those journeys which will always be a long road ahead because people will keep asking for more and more. Tell us, but depository accounts itself in the past 24 months, we've gone up by over 10 to 15 million. Even in the lockdown, I think it's closer to 20 million. So this number is now close to 50 to 60 million. And that number is increasing tremendously. And the more that number increases, the more is the set of expectation which you're going to be addressing in your studies, Amit, and meeting the global objective of people looking for this. But after that, let me just bring it down to a few points which I'm looking at. One, I think transparency is no longer a choice. It is an imperative. Neeraj mentioned it. I think every action which one takes, every decision which one is looking for or taking, one has to be 100% sure it is going to be out there in the public domain. That obviously means that the necessity or the demand or the expectation of how you arrived at that decision is also something which everybody is looking for that information. So it is not just going to be bringing out what the decision was, but how the boards came to that decision, which is going to be equally critical. And now that will have to be shared with complete transparency with the entire shareholder community. And that is a clear expectation, a clear demand, which I think is no longer a choice. And I repeat, it is an imperative. One good thing we've seen during this pandemic, and it's been the worst of times, but there have also been some best of silver linings coming out of it. You mentioned some work from home, the digitization, corporate balance sheets becoming, losing the flab and making it more fitter, corporate models getting more fitter. But more importantly, if you look at it, it's the one where the leadership was strong, where you saw them taking care of the boat much better in the storm. And I think that is now very well acknowledged. And add to that a significant point of ESG, something which is no longer on the side of the plate, but which is in the center of the plate. In fact, more and more discussions we've been having with investors across the globe, and more so in the past 24 months, I'm seeing that the ESG part of it has catalyzed dominantly. And everybody is now beginning to ask questions on the ESG side of the Indian corporate world, and how boards are now looking to do that, how boards are including that in their daily operations, in their decision making, in their objectives, to the point that, that national infrastructure pipeline which we have, which Invest India runs, we also have the India investment grid. The national infrastructure pipeline is a part of that. We have over 10,000 plus projects where anybody can look at those projects and see they can participate in debt and equity. We are now rating them on their ESG compliance. We are looking to start doing that. And these are all now being driven by the global investing community. So apart from the good corporate governance, Amit, I think going forward, you will start seeing more and more determinants to be brought into your framework where ESG is concerned. The good part there is that I think the world today acknowledges the strong leadership and the focus which we have on the entire green, the climate, and the ESG part of it. That is very well acknowledged now. But now we need the corporate world also to start picking up. And I think we have some tremendous stories on it. We have a special program apart from the startup program, which you mentioned. Startup India's, the Invest India is the execution arm for that, is also the Agni program, which is under the principal scientific advisor to the Prime Minister, which is accelerated growth of new India innovation. And what we are seeing there is we have a subset of that called the waste to wealth. A lot of global interest in those kind of activities, which were initially, I used to notice, a part of the CSR part of a large number of corporates, but now is becoming more mainstream. That takes me to the other point, that good corporate governance should not just be looked at as another regulatory checkbox which needs to be done. It is a value proposition. Neeraj mentioned it was driven by the shareholders. To my mind, the real success will be when we see it being driven by the promoters themselves, without any kind of a requirement from the shareholder. And the point being that now you're seeing it getting transformed into value. I mean, Neeraj, and I'm sure, Amit, you've been doing studies on the PE implications of good corporate governance and perceptions of that one. And the best thing which you do there is to bring out best in class, so for others to follow on that one. And be it the structuring of the board, be it bringing out or bringing in all the stakeholders on the same page in terms of information sharing, disclosure and transparency, or be it the responsibilities of the board themselves and the independent directors. I remember being on the committee for independent directors and what their role should be. And I remember going through multiple reiterations coming to those suggestions which were finally brought in. And here I must compliment again SEBI and the regulator who've been doing a tremendous job on this effort. But it's teams like yours which are taking this forward. Institutional investors are going to be a reality. You will see more and more of them. You may call it activism, or you may call it more and more participation in the governance of the company. That is a reality which we are all going to face. That is a reality which every corporate entity has to take on more. But let me now start with something and a request to you. Two elements and two focus areas which is very important for you, apart from the big corporates. And I was seeing the names which have typically been coming out in your past reports have been the larger corporates, the larger entities. You see, we again have 50 to 60 million MSMEs. And my startups today, which are going to be the big boys tomorrow, I think that is where we need to bring it from day one. If you bring this as a part of the DNA of that corporate entity when it is set up, from day one, you will see their ability to be able to create not just the unicorns, but the big boys of tomorrow on a fast track is going to make it much easier. And let me also be very candid that when you're just starting off the business, this is not really the first objective on your mind. Your objective is to get that business going and to get it executed. But reports like yours, efforts like yours, Amit, are the ones which are bringing this and a greater awareness of it. And here, I must compliment IFC, I must compliment the Bombay Stock Exchange, the government of Japan, and all those which have been supporting these kind of studies, that we now need to take it onto a more active basis to reach out to the small entrepreneurs and to start, even if there are small coaching classes, there are online learning modules which can be created, but to start at the initial phases itself. And we will be more than happy to see and work with you on wherever that is possible and how you think we can do that. And now with an entire digital framework, I'm sure that is something which we can work on towards. And something which I'm looking that if you can create similar points of excellence, examples of excellence, because that is what works tremendously well when you can showcase those to the others in the peer group for them to follow. And a clear roadmap as to how it led to that. It is not just the final results which you look at, but also the roadmap to those results, which is also going to be significant. So I know, let me compliment you once again. You have Banmali, you have Kalpana, you have Tahir, who are the experts who will speak more on the subject and share their views and thoughts. But with that, I'm also looking forward to go into this report greater in detail, Amit, and thank you once again. It is truly something what you're doing, which is adding great value, not just to the corporate world, but the entire global investor community, and creating a perception for India, which is of trust and credibility, as was well put with Neeraj. With this, back to you. Thank you, and congratulations to you and the winners.
Thank you very much, Deepak. If we have some time, so if you're okay, can I just ask you a couple of questions in terms of the nature of what you're doing, so that we can share it with a wider audience. So, one of the questions which often comes up and companies often ask is, India is a large state, different geographies, large country, different geographies, different states. So can you talk a little bit about how you're working with different states so that, and each of them have their own labor laws, their land acquisition laws, etc. So can you just throw light for the audience out here in terms of how you see that progressing and how you see that changing, how it's changed over the last 3-4 years, and how you think it's going to change going forward, so that companies who are looking at investing in India will find that ease of access to both land and labor. Capital, of course, people of this audience know a lot about, but those two factors of production.
Thank you, Amit. Let me first quickly start. I think it's a very unique platform, even if I may say so. And I assume it's probably the only platform in the country where all the state governments and the central government together are equity holders of it. We are 100% funded by the government, but they are equity holders. So that shows how the center and the states, the federal and the states, are working together now where this effort is concerned. What we've also done is that just to show that how it's an entire stakeholder participation to get the momentum going, we also have the business groups join us on the board. And they are also equity participants on that one. So we have stalwarts from the business who bring that in. Now, what is it which we do? Actually, it was rejuvenated, restarted, restructured, reimagined in 2015 by the Honorable Prime Minister when he came in. And from that perspective, I currently have 4 verticals. My first is investment promotion and facilitation, in which I have teams which is in every state and every department of the Government of India. The second is a team which is dedicated teams to the main countries. We have special desks for them. So I have the sectors, the states, and the countries. We work with all the missions overseas. It's the center point for that. What we do in this is starting from showing the India opportunity to hand-holding the investor, to helping them with their India plan, getting them all approvals, and in the process, getting them started, and even when the business is here, to get them, hand-hold them with all the issues which may arise of it, To put it in short, today I'm handholding $157 billion of indicated investment, over 30 lakh jobs to be created out of that, 30 million jobs, sorry, and 3 million of those jobs already created. Sorry, 3 lakh of those jobs already created and 30 lakhs in the offing. What other aspect of this part is that, for example, the policy making, the PLI policies, the FDI policies, the industrial policies, the team had a huge role in bringing in the inputs into that one. Also creating that entire ease of business structuring. What are the elements which we can bring in it both at the state level and the center level? How do we bring in global best practices and get them adopted? How to upscale the Indian land banks? How to digitize that entire journey? For example, the national single window, which we just launched 3 months ago, the beta version. It's one single window, Amit. You can come to an investor. It'll ask you a few questions. You will have one form if you're putting up an entity. And with that one form only, you fill in all your details there, which is required. You submit all your documents. All your central and state government approvals come through that. We have the National Infrastructure Pipeline, which shows you a menu of projects which global investors can invest in. The India Investment Grid, I've had over 189 countries which are visiting it regularly with investors across the globe. Again, a menu of options for investors to come and do it right away. So we've totally digitized this entire investor journey to a large extent, bringing it easier for them. We have examples where, the world's largest wind power company, Vestas, when they were setting up a plant in India to create and manufacture of a blade, the windmill blade, the best example they had was in a neighboring country where it took them 18 months. We did it for them under 14, just a little over 14 months, 23 days. Basically, best utilization of capital, kicking up the IRRs, again, making India a preferable destination, and doing the same at the state level, helping them identify which are the sectors. The second is Startup India. You remember the Honorable Prime Minister launched it in June 2016. We are the ones who are the execution arm for Startup India, everything from policy making. Today, the good thing is 30 states of ours have a specific startup policy themselves, apart from the Government of India policy, to creating this entire ecosystem to make it happen. This is a classic business school case study now, which is being picked up by some business schools, that in a short period of time, which is 6 to 7 years, you have a policy which has been executed with stakeholders, which has resulted where India is number 3 in the world in number of unicorns, number 2 in the world in number of startups, and number 1 in the world in new startups adding every day. And if I may add a little advert on that, Invest India, the World Bank just did a case study on Invest India, that how in such a short period of time an enterprise of excellence can be created. And they've shared this across the world. So Invest India now is rated as the world's #1 investment promotion agency by the UN itself. And an acknowledgement of that is that it has now been elected unanimously as the president of the World Association of Investment Promotion Agencies with 105 countries based out of Geneva. That is because of the excellence which this organization has added. The third is the Prime Minister's Science and Technology Initiative, under the Prime Minister's Principal Scientific Advisor to the Prime Minister, Professor Vijay Raghavan, which is what I was speaking about. What you're doing there is picking up all innovation in the public and the private space and fast tracking it to commercialization, including bringing it into every aspect of governance, every department, into our armed forces, the BSF, the police, everywhere. And that is, again, a very vibrant, active program. There's a very strong waste to wealth part to it, where we are executing a number of programs on that. And you can probably have a look at it right across. And the last is creating this entire digital framework, which is monitored at the highest levels of how well a project is executed. And these are being executed in the fast track basis. So that entire monitoring of these large projects, which earlier used to take a long period of time, and now are being monitored by the highest officials in the government on a regular daily basis, is fast tracking the economic growth. So that was, in short, a long answer to your short question, Amit. Thank you.
Thank you. And just want to, now that I've got you, and if you have a few minutes to spare, I just want you to talk to us a little bit more about the whole startup ecosystem, because, it is, unlike that you kind of go and, in a sense, you've kind of lit the fuse and you've got all these rockets going up. It can't be that simple. It has to be a combination of different factors which come in. It has to be, the infrastructure, the rules and regulations, the ideas, the entire ecosystem. So would you like to talk about that and how it is being perceived in the government? Because, you kind of think of the government as stodgy, they kind of don't like to experiment, don't like to do new things. And here you've got an organization which is kind of making the very things which could be anthema to the government. So do you want to kind of talk about these contradictions and how your organization has kind of bridged this gap between the government and the private sector, particularly in this startup space?
Amit, first, let me just give you a quick answer on that one. I think the platform really helps. So look at all the stakeholders. We've got all the state governments with us on the same platform. They're equity holders. We've got the government of India. That means all departments and ministries of the government of India. And then you have the private sector. So you've got all the stakeholders together, and we have been able to join the dots very quickly. But coming back to your question, I think that this is a classic case study, which is what I mentioned, which is now being picked up by global business schools, of how efficient policy making together with stakeholder participation can create magic. As I told you, we are just 72 months old. We are probably a young startup nation in the world in many ways. Look at it, how that policy got created. On 16 January 2016, we were told to come up with what is a startup. We started from scratch. And then what happened, what I really liked, and that I have to compliment the entire government machinery on that one. The policy got created and is being reflected and changed regularly based on stakeholder consultation. Probably one of the most extensive and intensive stakeholder consultations which I have seen with feedback. And that is what is creating this policy. And the fact that this policy is being looked at as an open-ended policy where as the market is maturing or moving to a different direction or a different horizon, whatever the new needs are is being brought in on a very fast basis and being incorporated in this policy making. That is the first element of it, that policy making was done in a fluid manner without it having a very strict architecture, but in a very focused manner. The second one was every policy element was based on an outcome. What happens with that? Once you can measure it, you know how to get to it. So the road direction was then implemented and that execution was monitored on a virtually daily basis by the senior most officers of the country. Now, once the central government started doing that, you had the state federals moving in very fast. That is when we worked with each state, picking up their specific USPs and creating a state-specific policy. And what helped there is whatever was a good practice from one, we would take it to the others. And finally, we had sharing of successes across. In fact, one of the best examples I have, so we monitor and rank the states on this one, Amit. It's very interesting. You know, you have the state EODB ranking exercise, and startup is a part of that. But what was the best part when you talk about cooperative competitive federalism? In the last exercise we had states helping each other come up the curve. So you had a state which was a little laggard, joining hands with a state which was doing very well. And you suddenly had these jumping up the curve about 10 to 12 positions, many of these states, because others were helping them. To my mind, this was one of the most gratifying things which comes out of India. I've had state governments where an investor has gone to them telling me that, this investor might be better suited for what they're looking for in a state X. Why don't you just send it there? It is brilliant the way you saw the cooperative competitive federalism take shape. And obviously led on very tight timelines with clear impact assessments by the central government on each of these. And even today, the stakeholder consultations and inputs, now it's been institutionalized by creating bodies around it, which is happening on a daily level, and policy being reformed, revised, changed, and being incorporated to bring it out. It's magic, really. And it is This story of Startup India is one of the classic examples for you to see of how fast India is changing, how it is unprecedented transformation, both at the pace and the scale at which it is happening, and it is laying the foundation for a new India. As I said, today I'll tell you the best thing of Startup India, Amit. Today, of the 739 districts, I have a registered startup in 650 districts of India. To my mind, that is the biggest success of the startup. Not just that in 2020, it took you 30 days to add a unicorn. In 2021, it took you 9 days to add a unicorn. In 2022, you're adding a unicorn in 5 days. It is this bottom up approach of India. The new India, which is being born out of this, is going to be a bottom up, with every small city and village being an engine which will propel the growth of New India, and not just limited to the 12 or 14 urban centers.
Thank you. That's really gratifying to hear, and it's very heartening to hear. It's good to know that, we kind of, I must confess that, my sense was that, look, you're trying to attract some of the old world companies into India, but your approach of kind of reaching out to the sleepiest corner of India, galvanizing that, getting startups there, attracting capital, attracting larger companies to come here, working with state governments and the different departments is going to be transformative for India. So thank you very much for your comments, and thank you very much for sharing all this with the wider audience. I'm sure they'd be very, just like I'm very happy to hear about that, they would be equally gratified to know about the fact that how focused the government is to change things and ensure that India becomes the go-to destination for anyone wanting to set up a new business, wanting to invest, wanting to start a new industry. They are all kind of looking at India in a very, very serious way. So with that, I'd like to thank you. I'd like to thank you, Neeraj, for your kind words, and we'll kind of move on to the other parts of the session today. What we have planned, I'll just kind of quickly go through. There's going to be a presentation on the report and its findings. My colleague Hetal will walk you through some of those, after which there's going to be a panel discussion for which I'll come back, and we have Kalpana Morparia, who recently was the chairman of JP Morgan in India and is now on independent director on a few boards. We've got Banmali Agarwal from the Tata Group, and Tahir Badshaw, who's investor par excellence, to kind of talk about some of these governance changes. With that, I'm going to kind of move on to the next session, but before I hand over the screen to Hetal, I'd like to thank first the entire team at IiAS, who worked very hard to ensure that we've scored the companies, thought about them in the right way, and identified what the key trends are. So thank you all very much. I'd also like to thank IFC, BSc, and the government of Japan, who kind of started us on this journey, and their support in the initial years, their support from bringing in the right resources from a global pool as well as from the India pool has helped make it a fairly robust mechanism for measuring everything. So with that, I'm going to peel off and hand you over to Hetal. Once more, Deepak and Neeraj, thank you very much.
Thanks, Guru. Thank you.
Thank you, Amit, and everyone, welcome to this event. I'm just going to flash the presentation. Here we are. Okay, so I'm going to just talk about some of the conclusions from the assessment this year. We'll first just give you a broad sort of overview of what the framework of assessment is, get into what the results were, and more critically, what are the themes that we've seen through this assessment of 100 companies. Now, if you look at the BSE 100 companies, these account for about 2/3 of total market cap. It's almost 67%. Earlier it used to be 70%, but now it's roughly around 67%. So to a very large degree, it's a telling sign of how capital markets have it's a reflection of the larger capital markets, right? Um, so let me quickly take you through the evaluation framework. We base this on the G20 principles of OECD principles of corporate governance, which is widely accepted. Um, and there are six principles. Two of these, which is ensuring the basis of an effective corporate governance framework and institutional investors, stock markets, and intermediaries are more driven by the environment. Now you have to remember that because this, the G20 OECD principles of corporate governance are spread across nations, they have created also a base of an environment. Because we are using India as the fundamental base, we sort of not factored these in, but looked at the four principles which are actually in control of companies. So these are rights and equitable treatment of shareholders and key ownership functions, role of stakeholders in corporate governance, disclosure and transparency, and responsibilities of the board. Each of these are weighted 30%, except for role of stakeholders, which is at this point in time weighted at 10%, right? What's the perspective? One is to say that you're looking at a globally accepted model, right? The other is to say that we modified the model to ensure that it's relevant to the Indian context. I think the idea of saying that you look at a cut paste and or a cookie cutter sort of model doesn't work. You have to nuance it more and more in the context of the nature of companies in India, how they operate, what is the regulatory environment, what is the kind of board structure. So a lot of this has actually been modified in terms of where the principles are to what the scorecard finally assesses. So it benchmarks and global practices adjusted for the Indian context. It's taken from the lens of an investor. So therefore, we use publicly available information, basically information that an equity investor will have access to sitting outside, which is not unpublished and price sensitive. And we also modified, there are derivative versions of this scorecard that we've created for unlisted companies, even for lenders when they look at it from a credit angle, but that's sort of a separate conversation. This is more in the context of listed companies, right? Every sort of it's a set of 70 questions, and everywhere we ask this fundamental question. We ask a question, and there are three layers of assessment. So this is just a sample question, right? Does the remuneration structure for executive directors align pay with performance? There is no one is to say that there is just no variable pay, so it's fixed. So independent of whether company performs or doesn't perform, the CEO gets paid the same. The second is to say it's only long-term incentive structures, and third, which we consider to be a good practice, is that there is a relevant mix of both long-term and short-term incentive structures. Now, globally, if you look at it, the mix of variable vis-a-vis fixed pay would be anywhere between 67 to 95%. In India, as a broad thumb rule, it tends to be about 50%, and that's really where the market is. How do we do this assessment? It's a fairly detailed and comprehensive exercise. We look at annual reports for the past 3 years, all stock exchange filings, website disclosures. We review all the policies which are on the website. So, your related party transaction policy, your POSH policy, health and safety policy, remuneration policy. So, we have an analyst who will actually go through all of it. Any other publicly available information that we consider to be primary source of information, not necessarily Google and definitely not Google and media reports, but things like investor calls or media briefings, or you have key management personnel on business channels talking about the business. Some of these things are things that we sort of factor in. And over and above all of this is the substance over form kind of overlay. So there have been companies with very strong conflict of interest policies, but really in actual, when you look at it in terms of implementation, the implementation has failed. So therefore, we sort of adjust scores for that substance over form kind of overlay. So it's not something that you can really, check the box. When we do the particular analysis, we're actually looking for intent and follow through of all that has been publicly disclosed. How do we calculate these? Like I said, these are 70 questions. This is the scoring calculation. You have every score has a maximum 2 points, and we weighted this by 30%. So essentially, we're at a total base of 100. So the scores that we're discussing now are on the base of 100, right? And sorry, let me just, yeah. And once we do the scoring, we divide the total the companies into 4 grades essentially. So 0 to 50 is basic, 50 to 60 is fair, 60 to 70 is good, and above 70 and above is leadership. Now, you'll realize that it's not equally sort of spread out. It's not 25, 25, 25. Right? 0 to 50 largely because when we created the scorecard, we looked at how do Indian regulations sort of stack up vis-a-vis what you would see in other Asian markets. And you find that by and large, Indian regulations are far more difficult in terms of the requirements than what you would see in most of the other markets. So therefore, companies which typically check the box would reach a score of 50, and that's not wrong. Largely for the fact that if you look at comparison across markets, this would be very relevant, right? So 0 to 50 is typically just is basically that sort of bucket where you're checking the box. 50 to 60 again there. 62, when you look at the score of 60 and above, that's when you start seeing governance practices are extending beyond the compliance levels, right? There's actually a focus around trying to figure out what is beyond compliance that companies need to do, what are best practices. And therefore, as you go higher and higher, above 65, for example, you see companies with greater institutional investor holding, looking at positioning themselves differently and attracting more and more capital. At 70, you're looking at companies which are actually globally relevant. And most of these companies, in terms of their practices, tend to have a large institutional shareholding, stronger boards. And you will also find that these are companies which are looking at growing very rapidly, and therefore their governance practices are stemming from them being able to position themselves in that particular aspect. So this is the broad sort of basis of the assessment. Now we'll go to the assessments, and that's, I think, going to be interesting this year. There's been a lot of interesting results. Let's look at Sensex. So we've broken this up in the first part to say Sensex and BSE 100. So we just look at Sensex companies, right? 30 companies. Now these 30 companies roughly account for a little less than 40% of the total market cap, right? If you just look at these companies from where they've moved from 2019 to what's happened in 2021, you had 3 companies which were in leadership category, and now you are at 11 out of the 30 companies in the leadership category. So you're clearly seeing that even through the COVID times, right, the larger companies have been able to build their governance practices. They tend to have stronger boards, and that's really that's really a telling sign of why the index is also so well accepted. The other piece to look at it is, of course, between 2019 and 2020, there have been some index changes. And companies which have entered the index also have been, are considered to have better governance practices than those that have actually exited the index. So by and large, this sort of, this sort of fundamental improvement in Sensex is important to sort of see over the 3-year period. What's happened in the maximum, median, and minimum scores? Maximum scores the last 2 years have remained at 80. When we started scoring in 2016, right, Sensex companies barely crossed 70, and that's why our first leadership threshold was at 70. Today we have companies reaching a score of 80. So you can see they're well past the minimum threshold and clearly going far ahead of what we would consider to be, best practice. At the minimum score, medians, of course, and because of this whole sort of push upwards, right? Median scores have also increased. 63 has become 68, which is a dramatic shift because, if you look at it over the past several years, it's been in the region of around 58 to 60 range bound. But now we're actually looking at median scores themselves reaching 68. I suspect next year they might just cross 70. But at the lower end, you're seeing the scores, in the region of 45, 49, 50. I think that's really driven by the whole index composition where you have PSUs. PSUs tend to have, in terms of just compliance levels, there are several challenges, and therefore that sort of weighs the index down. BSE 100, we've got 6 companies in leadership, 11 in 2020, and this year we have 20 companies in leadership. And I must tell you, we've tried very, very hard. Our scoring has been fairly stringent. But really, this is how well corporate India has done even through the COVID crisis. Some of it is a function of lessons learned through the COVID crisis. But notwithstanding, the other piece to look at also is that, when you look at companies which are scoring 60 and above, that pool itself has now increased. Vis-a-vis being roughly equally weighted in terms of, 50-50 of score of good and leadership vis-a-vis, basic and fair. You're now seeing by and large 57, so almost 60% of the companies now in the good and the leadership category, which is again a telling sign of how practices in corporate India have improved at an aggregate level.
Will you see pockets that you will disagree with? Yes, there will always be pockets that you will disagree with. But in terms of just looking at it at a market level, that corporate governance practices have improved. Some of it is, yes, possibly through regulation, but a lot of it is actually through voluntary action rather than regulation, right? This is how the scores are by assessment category. So you'll see here two things, right? Two things to note. One is just the fact that when you look at the scores of transparency and disclosure, the median is high. At the lower end also the score is high, and at the time, and that's really what we're talking about, right? That the requirements of disclosure, just fundamentally driven by regulations, is significantly sort of tighter for Indian markets vis-a-vis most of the other markets you see in Asia. But the one correlation that you will always see in almost every year is the correlation of the overall score with the score on the responsibilities of the board category, right? And that tends to be a strong driver of the overall score. This year, what's happened is that the band has increased. That band has gone from 13 to 84, with a median of 55, which has come down slightly, but that band has actually increased, which also tells you that there are some companies that absolutely the higher end, and you have a lot which is actually pulling down in terms of boards, pulling down the overall scores. Again, I continue to say this, but PSUs tend to weigh down the overall scores. By and large, corporate India has done far better than it has in previous years, right? So this is a good sort of chart, right? It just tells you that when you look at the assessment, right, it's not that every company is going to be great at everything. It's just telling you that there needs to be a more balanced approach to looking at governance practices and then scaling in a much more rounded manner while going up the governance curve. Sectoral maintenance are changing slowly. IT has been at the highest end for the last few years. Financial services has increased in terms of scores. You're seeing that inching up. Consumer staples at 64 in terms of the median scores is fine. But I think when you look at it going down the curve, right, you'll see changes in healthcare, in industrials, telecom, and utilities. I think that's actually at the lower end, you'll see that the score has actually fallen, a function of the fact that you have more companies in the sector entering the index, and the PSUs weighing down the overall score. So sectoral medians are changing, but if you look at the top 3 or 4 sectors, those still tend to be the same. Information technology, financials, consumer staples, and consumer discretionary. These still tend to be the better governed sort of industry wise than you would see, and that's been sort of relatively consistent. Now, if you look at the BSE 100, right, and actually if you look at most of corporate India, about 2/3 of corporate India is owned by promoter families. And therefore, the score on, the median scores for promoter family tends to be really where the score of BSE 100 in terms of medians also tends to lie. Um, and this is really when you look at the ownership cutoff, right? Widely held companies, MNCs, tend to have better governance practices than what you would see for promoter families. And PSUs clearly at the lower end, as we were discussing, is really there. The difference now in the last maybe 1 or 2 years is what we are seeing also in terms of MNCs, right? Widely held companies have operated in a certain manner, but MNCs have periodically shown that the global parent tends to be more sort of take precedence over the Indian listed company. This would be in the format of saying actually in FY21, in fact, one of the critical issues of COVID was just the how unexpected it was and what was really the unpredictability around the business. And therefore, most companies went into a cash conservation mode, right? MNCs, in fact, bumped up dividends. Actually, dividend payout ratios tended to be significantly higher for MNCs than you would have seen them in the past 5 years. Now, you would argue, of course, that all shareholders get paid dividend, but MNCs tend to have very dominant shareholding. The global parent has to have a dominant shareholding, so therefore, you find that a lot of the money actually gets pulled out into the global parent. And this is, you have to see it in the context of the fact that a lot of the MNCs were actually sitting on a lot of cash for a long period of time. The other piece we are seeing also more steadily and slowly is the whole, having fellow subsidiaries, unlisted fellow subsidiaries in India and business sort of transitioning there. So some of these issues are now catching up with MNCs, and we're seeing the score therefore being a little bit more muted than it used to be earlier. Now look at the difference in what's really driving the difference between, in terms of all the categories. And we kept saying that it's, having a larger institutional investors, having a stronger board. And this year, what we decided was really to put the data together and show. So you've seen some ordinality, right, to a very large degree. So institutional investors' equity in leadership companies tends to be significantly higher, and promoter shareholding tends to be lower. Now you can argue, always argue the chicken and egg, but the larger point is that when you have a larger set of institutional investors, promoter shareholding, which is a little lower than full control of 75%, you will find that there is a much more balanced discussion between institutional investors and management in terms of what is expected corporate behavior, and therefore governance practices have a certain degree of expectations which these companies tend to meet. So this is really the impact of having institutional investors as part of your equity pool, which really drives a lot of the governance practices. And as companies raise capital, the more the promoters get diluted, the more vulnerable also they tend to be to how investors are thinking about these companies. So therefore, greater the need to meet their expectations, right? The other piece is stronger boards. Again, one of the we've said this for several years that it's actually the board which drive corporate governance, and this is the best. This is the data that we can put together. It's numerical, yes. Quality of boards is not necessarily numerical, also yes. But the quality of boards, the quality of directors that you will see in some of these leadership companies tends to be far ahead of what you would see in most of the others, and the degree of independence as well, right? So diversity is also much better. So when you look at the whole skill mapping and all of that, you will find diversity also tends to be significantly greater. At this stage, we've looked at gender diversity and just putting the data together and showing you that there is indeed a correlation between having a stronger board, having a larger set of institutional investors with better governance practices. And this is a reflection of that. Let's look at BSE 100 versus Sensex. By and large, these have been in the range, but in 2021, we saw a significant spike in how Sensex companies have performed vis-a-vis the rest of BSE 100. And that actually prompted us to think about why is that really happening? As you can see, right, the difference between BSE excluding Sensex is 59 vis-a-vis Sensex being at 68, which is a significant jump. If it's a set of 70 questions, you're basing it on 100, right? Every single question may not have a material impact, but a whole set of questions creating a median score which is significantly high does have a material impact. So what's really driving this, and can we really figure out what is happening as far as Sensex companies are concerned and BSE 100 companies are concerned? It's pretty much the same analysis. You have larger set of institutional holding in Sensex companies. Again, you can debate that is it because they're Sensex companies, you have by force, you have more funds which are invested in in these companies or otherwise, or because they're well governed, they're attracting more equity. It's sort of, you can figure out which comes first. But by and large, from a trend perspective, right? Larger pool of institutional shareholding in Sensex companies vis-a-vis the rest of BSE 100, and it's a sharp difference. The same you'll see also for boards. Average independence of boards and vis-a-vis gender diversity, you'll find that there is a significant difference for Sensex companies vis-a-vis BSE 100. The other analysis, and again, this is more of a key takeaways kind of thing. If you read the report, you'll also find we've done an analysis of companies which have entered the index and exited the index, and what would be their median scores. And we find that companies which have entered the index have had better governance scores than those in terms of a median than those which have exited. And that's really telling you that even tacitly, right, indices are also factoring in the quality of governance of companies. When they make these changes, it is actually getting factored in. So you can either say markets reward governance and therefore companies come into the indices or vice versa. But at the end of the day, that's really how it's playing out, right? These are the companies in the leadership category this year. There are 20 companies. And like I said earlier, we've tried really, really hard. We've been fairly stringent in our assessment. But these 20 companies make the cut by all measures. Interestingly, some of the newer listed companies, HDFC Life, ICICI Lombard, ICICI Pru have made it to the cut. The other newer entrants to this list are Kotak Mahindra Bank, Mahindra and Mahindra, Tata Consumer Products, Tata Power, Tata Steel, Titan. The Tata Group, in fact, when we look at the whole, we look at how Tata Group has progressed over the last 5 years as far as the quality of governance is concerned, and transparency, disclosure, and all of it. Over the last 5 years, there has been a tremendous sort of change in the way the group has operated. And this year, we have 5 out of the 7 group companies listed in BSE 100 as part of as the leadership scores. Similarly, you're seeing like the newer listed companies, right? Part of larger groups which are fundamentally widely held, and widely held companies, as you saw earlier, tend to have a higher median score, right? Kotak Mahindra Bank, M&M, Mahindra and Mahindra was, I think, part of our list 2 or 3 years ago, and now it's come back. Kotak Mahindra Bank has actually entered the leadership scores for the first time. So this is the list. Congratulations to all these companies. We will be sending out a certificate to you all with, giving you with a certificate saying that you're part of the leadership team. You have a leadership score. Yeah. Okay. So this is really where uh, the entire sort of companies stack up, right? The top 11, top 20. I think we're going to go to larger issue on the markets value governance, and we already saw that index inclusions are really, have at some level correlation to governance practices. So when we look at price performance of these companies, and this is again, this is not sort of back tested, look at current data and then look at it backwards, but this is we look at companies that we evaluated in 2018, 17, so 19, 18, and 17. And then we look at how did these companies perform on price as well as stock beta going forward, right? And therefore, you're saying that very clearly companies which score good and leadership at a portfolio level tend to outperform those which score less than 60, which is the basic and fair category. At a portfolio level, of course. Will there be exceptions? Yes, there will be exceptions. But by and large, you're seeing this consistent conclusion over 3 years. And therefore, markets, you can talk about the fact that markets clearly do reward governance, right? This is price performance. You look at also stock beta, right? It's the same thing. You are seeing companies which are better governed having lower stock beta than the rest. Markets have definitely been choppy, so the difference has narrowed. But even then, you've seen that the well-governed companies tend to have lower stock beta. Uh, let's look at governance trends, and this is interesting because, like I said, BSE 100 is roughly 2/3 of the total market cap, so it gives you a sense of where the market is. Board engagement level, and this is a measure of basically board meeting attendance, right? I think one of the things we've been seeing over the years is that investors are voting against directors that don't attend board meetings. Now, while companies argue that these directors are indeed, valuable and they contribute in ways other than attending the board meeting, you still see that pushback. And honestly, attending the board meetings is the only sort of proxy measure we will have sitting on the outside in terms of how engaged board members are. So while there was this whole earlier, pre-COVID, uh, the use of video conferencing was always allowed, but that was not really very accepted. But that has significantly shifted from post-COVID, and you're seeing attendance levels jump up significantly. Is the acceptance of the fact that this is now the new way of working, and therefore doing virtual meetings is here to stay. And this is also therefore true for board members attending AGMs. Although we find that there is still room for improvement, there has been a significant change over the past 3 years through the COVID, through the pandemic. Right? Board independence. Um, if you look at the data around number of independent directors, you see that over the last 3 years, the number of independent directors in absolute numbers has actually come down. A function of that is really where PSUs are. A lot of the PSUs don't have independent directors, or maybe will have 1 or 2 independent directors. So, in terms of absolute numbers itself, the number of independent directors have reduced. So, and you will also see this trend in terms of companies that are meeting the regulatory requirement, right? That itself is a drop from 95% to 88%. So, and you're looking at, and that's really one of the reasons why the drop in median scores for the responsibility of the board category of scores is concerned, right? The other thing we look at is do companies have, in terms of composition, right? Globally, it's considered best practice to have at least half the board comprised of independent directors. In India, the composition gets driven by regulation, right? If you have an independent chair, then you have to have one third as independent directors. If you have a promoter or an executive director, then you have half the board as independent directors. But when you look at companies that have at least half their board comprise independent directors, and these are not the tenured independent directors, right? Independent directors all with a tenure 10%. That's inching up, but it's still relatively low at just 28%. If you do the data cuts and you look at companies in leadership vis-a-vis the other categories, you'll find that a lot of the skew is towards the companies in the leadership category. But this is an area that corporate India needs to sort of look at a little bit better. Of course, 2024, the whole grandfathering of the previous independent directors' tenure is going to fall off, and yes, there has been a slow and steady transition of boards as well. But in terms of having at least 50% of the board comprised of fresh, objective minds, I think is will serve corporate India well. Boards that have separated chairperson and CEO roles. This has been a very contentious debate of late, with SEBI, bringing in the regulations and then sort of bringing back the regulations on all of this. I think when you look at this question, we're not testing for relationship between the CEO and the chairperson. We're just looking at whether there is a separation of roles, and where companies have had executive chairpersons, we don't believe that's effectively separation, right? So therefore, this is really how the scoring has been done. So there has been an increase in companies which have separated the chairperson and the CEO roles, but a large proportion of them, there will be pockets where the chairperson and the CEO will be related to each other. That's a function of just the family structure and family ownership of corporate India. I think the pushback that corporate India has given SEBI, and you can debate whether SEBI should or should not have rolled back, but the larger issue is more succession planning. Are boards really thinking clearly about succession planning? Is succession planning for family controlled entities necessarily driven by the bloodline, or should it be driven by experience, competence, and skills, right? Uh, so that's really the question that boards today are still tentative about. They're walking on eggshells around succession planning and not really addressing that in a much more forceful manner. And we'll come to some of those discussions a little later. The other piece is, of course, gender diversity, meeting the regulation around, having at least one independent director. Most of this is compliant. I think most of the gaps you'll find are either women who have sort of left the board and they're looking for a replacement, or basically PSUs again. Um, how have how has corporate India done on women on boards? And I think one of the conversations we're now pushing for is to say that it's not about having one woman on the board or two women on the board, right? It's about having looking at gender diversity as a percentage of board composition. So if you look at the Nifty 500, right, or you look at the top 500 companies, by and large, women account for about 17% of total directorships held, which is, while it is low, it's up from 6% pre-regulation of 2014. So to that extent, it's been a significant increase, step by step, 1% every year. I think the number has languished through 2020 and 2021. I suspect boards have been focused on dealing with the pandemic, so some of these issues are not changing the board, and making too many changes at this stage may not be be on their sort of forefront. But notwithstanding, when you look at there are, out of the BSE 100, just 12 companies which comprise more than 30% of the board as women. So there is some work left to be done despite the progress that we've been making. And this is an area which we think corporate India needs to focus on. There's enough research which says that having at least 3 women or having 30% of the board actually creates a more effective gender diversity than simply having one woman on the board. One woman can always be shouted down, but when you have a more balanced mix, that's really when you get the best of the diversity. Succession planning, and this is what we're talking about. So we talked about the whole gender diversity thing, and then this whole separation of roles and succession planning, right? Have companies that have articulated a succession plan for either the board or senior leadership. I think in most of the cases of the 61%, you're going to find that it is actually for senior leadership. There is obviously a pipeline, a leadership pipeline, training, grooming, all of that happening for managerial level. and senior leadership. But when you look at finally, is there a succession for the promoter? Is there a succession for the board? That tends to be an area which still is not purposefully getting addressed. For family-owned companies, we do see that there is, there are family constitutions being created. So the family's got itself right. It's got itself clear in terms of how this whole structure is going to navigate in the absence of the matriarch or the patriarch, as the case may be. But there's very little disclosure for investors. And this is now something that companies need to address. The NRCs now need to look at this in a much more sort of proactive manner, rather than leaving it tacitly to the promoters to sort of find a solution to succession planning. I think this continues to be an area that we've been area of concern, more so given the nature of promoter controlled companies in India. Board diversity, and when we look at board diversity, we're looking more in the context of skills, right? So one of the lessons from corporate failures is that you need to have people on the board who understand the core domain. And that is how you will have enough people who will be able to challenge the management's assumptions in terms of their strategy and plan. I think corporate India does well, most of them do. But a large proportion of this is also family, right? Promoter families and non-executive roles who are now on the board. I think having independent directors, understanding the core domain of the business is really critical to having a robust set of skills on the board. And this is something that we're now going to evaluate going forward. The other piece, of course, is, whether there's diverse and comprehensive set of skills. I think when we look at one of the most important aspects of skill diversity, it is, technology. The business is now moving virtual. Technology is becoming far more ingrained. It is indeed a part of every operation and everything that companies do. And therefore, do you look at technology risks at the board level? Do you have experts in technology at the board level? So these are some of the newer age, issues which companies are facing. And therefore, do they stick with the current set of skills of just having accountants and, legal experts and the sorts? Or do you now look at newer set of skills? And that is really one of the issues that we are also trying to address. Uh, SEBI, of course, has asked companies to publish director-wise skill level with the hope that companies will now, or boards will now look at, building a cohesive set of skills around where the company is going and what the company really needs. And that's really the intent of weather regulations. This is an area which I think, which we think sort of boards still need to focus on, and make a significant change if this is something that they actually finally get right for them. Executive remuneration through the COVID crisis has been unfortunately disappointing. We've always been raising the issue around the fact that executive remuneration has outpaced, corporate growth, both in terms of revenues and profitability. This has been a trend line we've seen for several years in the past. In the COVID crisis, given how harsh the crisis has been for a certain segment of society, we would have expected leaders of corporate India to show a lot more restraint. Several did. Let me not take that away, right? Several did. They took significant pay cuts, worked at 1 rupee, worked at no pay through the COVID crisis and stood in solidarity with their people. But by and large, when you look at it for the 100 companies, we are seeing a disturbing trend of the fact that the alignment to company performance has actually deteriorated through the crisis. One of the functions of that is simply that promoters are built in fixed increases into their pay. Most of the promoter pay is fixed. Alignment structurally as well as in absolute terms with how the company has performed has weakened through the COVID crisis. The other issue, and Amit talked about this when he started off, saying is really stock options. This is the most voted against resolution. Uh, you know, in terms of just the number of companies which sort of have stock option schemes out of the 100, right? It's roughly 50-60% of companies which actually have stock option schemes. And if you look at the history of stock option schemes, they started off with, the IT and the banking sector being far more focused on stock options. And now slowly, of course, it's moving to the manufacturing sector as well. And you find for all the stock option schemes, just the alignment of these schemes to investor interest in terms of, granting them at an exercise price, which is equal to market price is low. Um, we understand the need for companies to, and there is obviously going to be a difference between the way investors and companies look at stock options, right? Companies look at it as deferred payment or retention. Investors look at it as alignment of interest. So we're taking the lens of the investor, so we look at alignment of interest. So while we understand the need for companies to grant stock options at a discount to market price, right? These would be maybe because the stock price is too high, they don't want to burden the employees, the larger, having to put out larger amounts of money just to exercise the stock options. The other could be the controlling shareholder doesn't want to dilute. So therefore, by giving a lower number of stock options at a significant discount, the upside is greater and therefore the dilution is lower. That's the other argument for that. But in all of this, when you're doing it at a discount, there has to be therefore stock option to vest with some kind of a performance metrics, which is the only way to align the interest of the shareholders and that of employees. And that itself is sort of a gap that we see. And it has been bridged. When you see startups now, which are now listing, right, this is becoming far more acute, where you have promoters taking in large, founders not calling themselves promoters, becoming eligible for stock options and taking large pools, large share of the entire pool. So this is becoming an issue that investors are now watching very, very closely. With the newly listed companies, you're seeing this becoming far more aggravated as a problem. And what 2022 will bring to us will be now interesting to see in terms of executive remuneration, whether that gets contained. We've now begun to hold a view saying that remuneration now needs to be a related party transaction where it gets voted upon by the majority of the minority. If that happens, of course, and if the regulation does change to that extent, we expect that a lot of the alignment will actually happen. Board evaluation, and we've actually written a paper on this as well, where we talk about the fact that board evaluation outcomes are really rarely disclosed. We're seeing an improvement, yes. A lot of the companies in the leadership category have made these disclosures. Globally, you see these disclosures actually sort of playing out quite well. You see boards articulate what is on their agenda, what are the things that they actually address, what are the things they're going to address in the next 2 to 3 years, and they also talk about what are the action plans and how they compare to what they had decided initially. You'll see this Marico's put out, for example, some parts of board evaluation. We've got several other examples globally also where board evaluation is being put out. And the idea of putting out this evaluation is to tell investors and stakeholders how the board is really thinking about the company and where the direction is. This isn't about saying director A got a score of 3 on 5 or 4 on 5 or 5 on 5. I think that individual scoring, just like all performance appraisals, is not something that investors really want to see. It's more the direction of how the board is thinking, what is on the board's agenda, which investors really want to hear. And we encourage, therefore, companies to think about this a little bit more deeply and have a more nuanced articulation of what the outcomes are, rather than stick to the regulatory requirement of disclosing process of board evaluation. Conflict of interest. We talked about the whole conflict of interest issue around, how MNCs are operating, and conflict of interest continues to plague corporate India. Just the disclosure of the policy itself, you don't find that in almost half the companies of BSE 100. And when you do find, for the policies that you do find conflict of interest policies, they're basically limited to employees. They don't really encompass all stakeholders. So this is an area that, addressing conflict of interest, mitigating conflict of interest will essentially build greater trust among stakeholders. And therefore, while this has been sort of stagnant in terms of the issue over the past 3 years, this is something that corporate India can focus on. And that also brings us to the very contentious related party transaction, another conflict of interest kind of piece. So in the assessment here, we look at a number of companies which have brought related party transaction resolutions to shareholders, right? And you find it's roughly about 40 companies which tend to bring this to shareholder vote, and that's through a set of thresholds around revenues or kind of transactions and network. In terms of how corporate India is addressing this, right? A lot of the related party transactions are now happening without shareholder approval through subsidiaries, through other channels, through clever means, and these are things that needs and therefore the regulation cannot keep getting tighter and tighter. The more this happens, regulation becomes more prescriptive. SEBI's come out with this whole new set of regulations around related party transactions. They've dropped the thresholds in terms of what you need in terms of disclosure as well as shareholder approval. And this is going to get more and more prescriptive until corporate India really corrects itself in terms of how it's really looking at some of these particular issues. And simplistically, to say that a related party transaction policy should at the very least articulate the fact that directors will abstain from discussion and voting is not something we see in most companies. Everybody, a lot of the companies tend to look at it more in terms of we'll go with what the regulation says, and therefore, looking at regulation is not really governance, right? Governance has to be beyond, has to be what you proactively do beyond compliance and regulation, and that's this continues to be an area that we will monitor. Investors are getting far more vocal. While we are seeing resolutions pass more often, and if you look at the market structure, right, about 55-56% of the shareholding is still held by promoters, and therefore they will continue to have a dominant say in how resolutions pass. But when you look at the increase, and you look at BSE 100, right, if you look at the number of companies where shareholder resolutions were carried just by the promoter vote, uh, that's gone up, that's doubled. And a lot of this is going to be a lot of this is going to be related to remuneration, director appointments, and some of these kind of issues. So we're seeing pushback. You saw it last year a lot you saw resolution getting defeated in Aisha. You've seen pushback in Hero Motocorp on remuneration. So investors are getting more and more vocal. As interestingly, as newer companies are getting listed, these startups are getting listed, right? The pushback on some of the control rights embedded in the articles of association has been significantly high. So these are now issues that investors are watching very, very closely. And we expect that investors are going to provide more and more pushback going forward. So this is 2022 will certainly be an interesting year. Corporate social responsibility, the 2% of profits which has to be spent on CSR. I think COVID has put a lot of projects on hold. So that dropped marginally. And again, impact assessments weren't being, companies were not able to do impact assessments also because of COVID. And this is more of an understandable issue. I think what is interesting is to see that companies didn't sort of unilaterally give out the money to the Prime Minister's Relief Fund and say that, this is our CSR spend. But they're actually looking at running these projects and ensuring that there is value in the money that they spend. Managing stakeholders, see, this is another area that we find is a little disappointing. Corporate India has, for the past several years been stretching payments to suppliers. I don't know, it seems to be something which is considered par for course. But during the COVID crisis, it put a lot more stress on the SMEs. I think what's happened in the COVID crisis at the lower end, right? The people as well as businesses have been significantly stressed. And for larger companies, and these are BSE 100 companies, right? For larger companies, so they were going to manage our working capital by stretching payments to suppliers, only created more and more stress in the SME space. So this is again something that if you're looking at if companies are chasing the whole ESG piece, right, managing your stakeholders is part of it. You can't simply say I'm managing my balance sheet and therefore it'll be at the cost of the suppliers. Supply chains are now getting so much more integrated, and therefore the more you stress the suppliers, the stress is going to come back to these companies at some point. It's just going to sort of find its way around back. I think this is something that corporate India needs to focus on a little bit better and think through a little bit more than simply looking at it in the narrow context of I need to manage my balance sheet, right? And of course, whistleblower policies. Whistleblowers have in 2021 played a huge role globally. You've seen this in Facebook and you've seen this in several other companies. And India hasn't seen this kind of a whistleblower yet, but whistleblower policies tend to allow stakeholders to articulate some of the issues which concern them. I think when we look at whistleblower policies, a lot of the policies are again only for employees. Just extending them to stakeholders is where we believe the fundamental value is also, because finally the company doesn't operate in isolation with its employees, right? It is engaging with the societal structure, and therefore ensuring that you're extending it to your suppliers, customers, or any other stakeholders which are engaging with the company is important. Managing employees, health, safety, and posh policies. I think this is an area where it's companies aren't doing badly on it, but I think the disclosures are limited, right? A lot of this becomes very, very narrow. It becomes very internal focused. But these are not internal focused issues, right? We talk to enough number of board members who say that the first thing in a board meeting we discuss is health and safety, number of accidents, what happened in the plant, all of that. And so, yes, there is indeed a focus on this, but the disclosure levels are actually very low. And this is, and just 50% of the companies actually having publicly disclosed policies is an area of concern. And so, to this extent, I think this is something companies can do a little bit better. So this is really what the governance scorecard is. We've decided to make a few changes to the scorecard, and the idea of making these changes fundamentally is to say that, one is that a lot of what was considered best practice is now embedded into everyday practice. So it's just accepted that this is the way things are going to be done, and therefore, sort of scoring companies on things which seem to be obvious and being practiced by everybody else doesn't create so much of a differentiator. The other is there are more and more issues that we want to discuss and now want to move the needle a little bit further, right? So therefore, we added a couple of questions and modified a certain set of questions. Again, the changes are not, out of 70 questions, the changes are fairly limited. It's just sharpened the scorecard a little bit that much more and made it more relevant to where we are, reduced a little bit of repetition. And therefore, it's just a cleaner sort of structure that we've created. What we've also done is change the leadership cutoff from 70 to 75. Like I said, right, we've seen companies now, a lot of what they do is considered best practice. So we are sort of changing that threshold a little bit, just making it slightly more difficult and changing that cutoff to 75. We put out a consultation paper in November 2021. The consultation paper is still available on our website. And if you read the report that we have on our website now, you will find the details of the changes that we've actually made to the scorecard for your understanding of what's changed and what hasn't. And that's it. A bit of a caveat, of course, governance is, scorecards have their limitations, as will all frameworks, but this is where we are. So thank you for your time. I'm going to hand over back to Amit, who will take over the next sort of session and Amit.
Thank you. I was hoping there'd be some time for a Q&A, but we've clearly kind of touching the margin. So we'll kind of jump into the next session. I think all the panelists have joined us. So thank you very much and welcome to the panel discussion which we have. We've got a great panel lined up for you in terms of diversity, and by that I'm not referring to gender, but in terms of skill diversity, which the panelists are bringing. We have Kalpana Morparia. She was my boss's boss for a long time, and she was then the chairman of JP Morgan till recently, and now she's on a few boards. And therefore her perspective is unique. We've got Banmali Agarwal. Banmali has been on the manufacturing side and on the infrastructure side for a long time in a large number of companies with all sectors which are now shunned upon, but he's kind of therefore being responsible or seen how the businesses for a lot of these are changing, and now he's on the board of Tata Sons. And as Hetal mentioned in her presentation, the big change we've seen over the last 2-3 years is how much the Tata Group companies have been able to come up the curve, and therefore maybe get him to share some of his thoughts on that. And I'm balancing all this is Tahir Badshah from Invesco. He's the one who at one level is asking companies and asking boards some of these questions, holding them to account for some of what they're doing, but he's got a perspective which is completely different from what companies have. But having said so, I'd like to believe that there is an alignment of interests. Only if companies do well, do investors do well, and only if investors do well, do they have money to invest in companies. So it's kind of a virtuous circle which they have with each other. But having said so, there is a different perspective which each of them have. I'm not going to kind of go through their bios in great detail. They're already on the website, or you could see it. So kind of let me jump straight into what I have planned. So maybe I can get all of you just to have some opening comments. And Kalpana, let me kick it in with you, get you to talk about, what are the changes you're seeing happening in the boards. You've been working very closely with boards. You've been a part of a board, not just in boards, not just in India, but also in the global market. So what are the changes you're seeing happening in the boards? And maybe if you can focus on ESG, it's great, but even otherwise, it'll be good to hear your perspective on that. Okay. Kalpana, it should be at the bottom of the screen, somewhere towards the...
Are you able to hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you now.
Okay, it was working the other way around. So I said thank you for having me. I will try and keep my opening comments to ESG because that's truly the topic of the panel today. So I would say over the last 18 months, this is a topic front and center across the various boards that I've had experience on. And I would say that there are two primary elements to the discussions in the board. One is the more substantive one. What is it that the company is doing on sustainability? And of course, it varies across sectors. So companies that are in heavily polluting industries, what is the pivot? Are they completely changing their business, or certainly the way they are going to be conducting business? And companies that are in maybe less polluting industries, what is it that they can do in terms of overall decreasing the carbon footprint? The S part of the ESG, I would say, is far more common across these sectors. And it's all about diversity, inclusion, social equity, etc. So that's one element of the substantive discussion. The other element of the substantive discussions is really in terms of the expectation of the stakeholders in terms of disclosures and monitoring. And the latter part is an area where I'm seeing a fair amount of evolution taking place. So unlike the accounting standards board, right? So we all have a pretty common understanding of disclosures across accounting. There may be variations between US GAAP and IFRS and IiAS in the Indian context, but there is a decades of work that the International Accounting Standards Board has done. So there is a fair amount of uniformity in terms of all of the financial disclosures that we make and the matrices that we track. I think the scene is evolving in the sustainability space. So a very good initiative now, which seems to coalesce all of these various different sustainability disclosures that you've seen, is what is attempted to be done by the International Sustainability Standards Board. And we believe that the pace of evolution there is going to be much faster than it took us in terms of IiAS. So that is the second bit that the companies are grappling with today, right? So there are expectations in the Indian context on what SEBI wants us to do. There are certainly EU standards, there are the SEC standards that are there. But I think if all of this eventually converges to the International Sustainability Standards Board, and we all have a fairly uniform way of disclosures, monitoring, matrices, it'll make the life of all stakeholders, and I would say particularly companies whose responsibility it is to report, and the investor community to understand this uniformly. So I'll stop there. Happy to get into details as we go along in the conversation.
Thanks a lot, Kalpana. The same question to you, Banmali, except I want you to wear two hats. One is at the group company as someone in the holdco level, and the other is what are the companies doing at their own level. If you can just quickly give us an overview of that.
Sure, Amit. Thank you so much. It's really a privilege to be on the panel. At the outset, let me just correct one thing that you said, Amit. I'm not on the board of Tata Sons. I'm the president of Tata Sons. I don't want you having wrong headlines tomorrow morning. You'll create a problem for us, and it'll be very bad for corporate governance. So that apart. Okay, but let me just start and kind of share some top level ideas, and just as Kalpana mentioned, and then maybe we can pick it up during discussions. First, more from a practicing manager and then being a member of the board perspective, I think we need to, before we get to the subject of reporting and disclosure, etc., I think we first need to really absorb this and understand this at the core of the organization. And I think there's some work that needs to be done over there, including sensitizing the board. To give you an example, I think Tata Steel would have spent at least a couple of years bringing in people and experts just to explain to the board the importance, the seriousness, the consequences of not going down a certain path. So forget the reporting and all. I think first is just the sensitizing, starting from the board and just appreciating everything. And that's really important. To be honest, I don't see enough of that happening. More needs to be done over there, and we can discuss that. The second is that I think it is maybe from a consultant's perspective, it's nice to package it as, an ESG offering that you can give to companies and etc., and to look at it as some kind of a center of excellence. But I would argue that E, S, and G are three separate areas that need separate handling and need separate focus. Of course, they come together at a certain level. There's no question about it. And they maybe come together only at the CEO's level. And therefore, that it's the CEO's involvement that would be very crucial. But each one of these needs a particular and defined strategic handling, which is very important. So I think it would be a mistake on the part of companies to just club it as some kind of a COE that is only engaged in reporting and giving out certain let's say statistics. The other point I'd make is that this is maybe the right approach to balance the short term and the long term. And the thing that has been debated time and again, this is an ideal and an excellent opportunity to figure that out. Because I think, again, as Kalpana mentioned, context is extremely important. A Tata Steel and Tata Power can't be looked at with the same lens as a TCS or a Tata Global or a Tata Consumer Company, and so on. So context is extremely important, and therefore having a strategy for each of the companies is extremely important. I would also say that from an investor's perspective, it's look at a company that's 125 years old that knows only one thing and is making a transition into something different versus a new greenfield company that's just starting up now and has the, in a sense, a certain luxury of only embracing things which are quote unquote nice. And I think that distinction, that nuance, I think needs to be understood, and we can talk about that more as well. The last point I'd make in this part is that I think it is time that we focused in India, and a lot of ESG actually pertains also to the manufacturing sector, that we focused on making manufacturing more profitable, having more margins, because let's make no mistake, at the end of the day, this does cost the company. And I get the point about, that this is good for the company, etc., but there is a cost associated with it. The only way to recover that cost is that if the companies make higher and better margins. And the only way the companies can do that is by positioning themselves on the back of know-how, intellectual property, etc., etc. The point I'm making is that it's time the companies started to make more margin, more money, so that you are able to do things in a fashion that is more acceptable to the world. Let me stop here in this segment, Amit, and happy to come back later.
Thanks a lot. I think it's interesting the point which you've made and Kalpana's also made. The fact that we've kind of bucketed ESG together, but in one sense they are distinct. This point was driven home to me a couple of months back when we were doing one of our ESG seminars for investors. And when we had the pharma companies speaking, they were speaking a lot more about the S in the ESG, but when we had the metal company speaking, they were talking much more about environment and sustainability. So I think that's kind of pretty valid. With that, let me kind of turn to you, Tahir. If you have, you've kind of got a completely, you're wearing a different lens. You're in a sense the receiver rather than, though of course there will be something which you do in your business, of course, but you're sitting on the other side of the equation, so to speak. How are you thinking about ESG at this stage, and how important is it to you as an investor?
Thank you, Amit. Thanks, IiAS, for having me on this panel, and happy to be a part of this. For us at Invesco, Invesco India's efforts towards ESG actually resonate our global commitment at one level. So our focus has been on integrating ESG into the heart of our investment process, and I'll come to why we say so. We are also very highly focused on meeting specific client needs, leveraging our broad range of capabilities that we have on providing the right ESG solutions. So for us at Invesco, our commitment to environment, social, and governance is total, and it's a key element of our ambition to be a client-centric asset manager. Our belief is that ESG considerations represent very material economic information that will help explain a company's future beyond what can be deciphered through typical financial statements. So the importance cannot be overemphasized. ESG investing for us is not as much about maximizing return as much as it is about mitigating investment risk. So we think of ESG more in risk terms because the consequences of not adopting ESG as early as possible on investment risk can be significantly high. And this risk typically does not manifest itself through short-term impact on earnings or growth or maybe immediate cash flows, but it comes in more through the long-term decline of the terminal value of the businesses. So that's what it has come to now, with the whole focus around the world, including in India, moving to ESG. So I think I would believe that there are various aspects of ESG that have an impact on value creation and risk management, and therefore it is very important for it to be woven into our investment philosophy. And this investment philosophy is not only about whether a company is doing well on ESG or not doing well on ESG. I mean, we know that there will be some companies and some businesses which will have a challenge as a starting point. So as Mr. Banamali said, that there are, to make a distinction between service-oriented companies and probably manufacturing companies, and they have different implications and different objectives and obligations to fulfill as far as E, S, and G are concerned. But what we are therefore looking for is not static ESG. We want to look at ESG momentum. We want to see how ESG is changing within a company, irrespective of whatever nature of business they might be engaged in. So we obviously as investors are also reasonably cognizant of the fact that there are some challenges to a certain business which are far more critical. I mean, for example, environment is very, very critical for commodity-based companies or manufacturing companies. But we want to see incremental change. We want to see incremental improvement. And I think that is what markets over a period of time will be concerned about. So we can't underemphasize. I mean, we have enough examples even in India of what happens to companies who have disregarded their responsibilities around environment, social, or governance. We've got especially examples on governance are replete in India. We probably may not have as many examples on environment and social as yet, But on corporate governance, we know of several entities where there's been a very debilitating effect on their market values. So I think it's only going more, only going to become more and more front and center as we go along.
Let me kind of, since you've said that, let me kind of stay with you on that. And I just want to understand from you how prepared, when you talk to companies, do they kind of get it that as an investor, you're focused on ESG? Do they understand that they need to be scrambling to put a strategy in place? They need to be scrambling to get their thinking in place. And the fact that increasingly investors here and globally are thinking a lot more seriously about ESG, or do you think it's all kind of the early stages? You'll go all of you, whether you're an investor or a company, will go up a steep learning curve. But at this moment, it's kind of a little bit give and take, and kind of leaving people a little bit more wiggle room to say that, yeah, we understand you're thinking about it, but we're going to be a little bit patient. Is that a fair characterization, or would you describe it differently?
I think what you said is a fair characterization. I think let's admit that this is a journey. I mean, for all of us, whether it is corporates, boards running it, and investors who are also on the other side grappling with it. So clearly, it is something which is evolving, and there are some things, for example, in governance. We, like as I said, and you know this better than I do, that boards have been continuously concerned, and examples over the last 10 or 15 odd years, even in the Indian context, are many, and they have served to overall improve governance standards in companies over the years. But we are not focused probably as a country as much on environmental and social related matters, and I think that is what probably over the next decade or so will gain a lot more prominence, especially in a tech-dominated world. So, for example, things like data privacy. I mean, that is something which is becoming very, very important from a social standpoint, especially the kind of integratedness that businesses now have with technology. So I think the relevance of other parameters over a period of time is only growing. We see a fair bit of sensitivity of organizations towards this. There are some companies who are ahead in the race. There are some who are evolving, but clearly the sensitivities, in our opinion, are rising. I think we as investors are also at some level giving that necessary push to boards and companies and managers to probably see it from an investor standpoint, and that is where the difference is. That we maybe in India we might have a challenge in terms of meeting certain standards, whether it is with respect to carbon neutrality or net zero emissions, versus what is expected from a global standpoint. But in that journey, I think we might probably stay a little, behind the curve, or we might take our own time, and we might argue that, as emerging market economies or developing nations, we probably need more time. But we don't have a choice from the point of view of foreign investors. Foreign investors are benchmarking us to other nations or developed markets nonetheless. I mean, and they are taking investor actions based on whatever they see around the world. So we as corporates and investors don't have a choice but to evolve at the same pace, as global investors want us to, and that tells on the valuations and multiples of companies.
Thank you. Thank you. Kalpana, let me, with that, come to you. The question is, you said it's kind of becoming increasingly important over the last 18 months. There's been a step up in the conversation which is taking place. So can I ask you that, how do you view it in terms of skills? So, we do believe that there's someone who needs to understand the business, who should be on the board. Increasingly, it's felt that, there is someone who needs to understand the digital landscape, who needs to be on the board. Would you kind of extend that to say that, look, someone who kind of has to understand at least the sustainability aspect of it? Governance, of course, is a skill which everyone will have, but at least let's speak about sustainability and what is happening and how the company should approach it. Do you think that's a separate skill? Or again, like governance, it's something which is well smeared across different people on the board. And the related question to that is, do you think the directors need to be reskilled for this, which is something which Banmali alluded to?
So I believe sustainability is core to the company's very purpose. So therefore, to say I want a skill set on my board that's going to focus on E and S, and assuming all of us are also focusing on G, I think is the wrong way to approach it. And in that context, I'm actually one of the few directors who have vehemently opposed the setting up of an ESG committee. I don't think this is something you can relegate to one committee of the board. It's a core part of a company's business, and therefore it has to be a core board agenda. You can decide on the frequency. Are you going to do it every quarter, every half year? That's your choice. And I also believe that there are multiple elements within the ESG framework that dedicated committees will have to look at. As you know, there is an increasing desire, particularly on the part of the investor community, to link executive compensation with identified ESG goals. In that context, it is absolutely essential for the comp committee to get involved in that very discussion and debate. Similarly, earlier I talked to you about disclosures and monitoring. Now, if these are going to be part of your annual report, the audit committee is obliged to seek assurance on those numbers. So to relegate something like ESG to a committee, I think would be the wrong thing to do. It's a core part of the board's business. And then these very specific committees will have to look at elements of it. And then it all gets woven together in terms of reporting to the board. On the skill set, I think that since this is such a core part of the company's business, I think all of us directors should be aware of it. If we need some sensitization, I frankly believe that certainly the companies whose reports you're going to be soon announced certainly understand the importance of this, and the directors make it their business to read literature on expectations from the stakeholder community from companies. So I don't believe we need training or anything like that, but maybe to the extent that some company boards are not sensitized, probably giving them greater exposure of some of the emerging trends might be helpful.
Okay. You also refer to something which is the fact that, increasingly there's pressure from investors to link environmental targets and bake those into the CEO's compensation numbers, whether he or she's met them or not met them. Do you kind of, the question is that, look, they're different. So you've got the environmental targets to look at, you've got diversity targets to look at, you've got, the business numbers, you've got geographical expansion, you've got regulations to deal with. Do you think that's the right approach, or you should kind of take a overview of the business and say, look, you're delivering on, this is where we want to be 3 years or 5 years from now, you're delivering on it, and therefore that's better than segregating each of these individual components to arrive at the number. I know Larry Fink had written about it and said that they'd like to see this baked into the compensation numbers.
So, it's the old adage, Amit, what gets rewarded gets measured. And therefore, if you're current and you need to put this significant focus in terms of pivoting the company, I would say it should form a core element of the balanced scorecard. As you know, we just can't be rewarded only on our quarterly financial performance or annual financial performance. So I would put that as an element. Companies can decide what amount of weightage they give. To my mind, the key thing from the stakeholder perspective, particularly the investor community, is you've got to be very transparent. So what are the KPIs that's going to determine the overall executive compensation? It's not just the CEO. I would count the entire executive committee or the senior management team, whatever nomenclature you give to it. How is their compensation linked with what we believe is core to a company? Disclose that upfront. At the end of the year, it's the absolute responsibility of the comp committee to ensure how they have performed vis-a-vis these KPIs. Just disclose that in your annual statements.
Yeah, that's a big part. What we find is that there is some degree of diffidence on behalf of companies or boards or NRCs, whoever you say, to kind of bring clarity. And that's one of the things which we find investors are increasingly pushing for. Banwali, let me bring you in there. And this is based on, again, something which Kalpana said. She said, look, it's a broader responsibility of the company. Who do you think owns the governance agenda? Is it the board? Is it the management? Because the tone is set at the top. How high do you go? Do you go all the way to the chairman, the board, or do you say it's the CEO? And related to that, of course, is that as a group, how are you all thinking about ESG? Is it the business which is kind of thinking out strategies and kind of presenting to at the board level and at the holdco level, or is it the holdco saying that, look, this is important and we want you to push, and it's pushing it down and asking the companies to focus on ESG. So both, I want first is ESG, but also governance as a separate item.
Yeah, sure, Amit. So first, at the outset, I completely agree with in the manner in which Kalpana articulated that this is clearly, and I'm now talking about ESG first, it is completely a board responsibility, meaning that it can't be relegated to a committee. Now, I'm not saying that it is not the CEO's responsibility. I'll just come to that point in a second. But this is a matter that requires the attention of the board on a regular basis. In many of our companies across the group, particularly the ones who are more quote unquote vulnerable, say like steel and power, etc., there is a separate session in the board meetings just to discuss certain elements of ESG and particularly around environment and so on. So this clearly has to go all the way to the top. But here are a couple of other thoughts, Amit. I think, do we as companies, and particularly maybe if I look at it from a manufacturing lens where this whole thing gets accentuated a lot, do we need to look at this in a defensive manner, or can we look at this as a competitive advantage? I would argue that within the Tata Group, we are looking at ESG as a clear competitive advantage, maybe partly because there's some of it that comes to us naturally, just given our DNA, etc., and part of it because we just see an opportunity to differentiate ourselves, mind you, not just within the country, but within the larger context of other emerging economies and so on and so forth. And let me explain this. If you just break up E, S, and G, the E part, I think, is really heavily technology dominated. It needs it's separate, different horses for different courses, etc. I think the part that has been articulated further, it's a question of, how fast can you go and so on and so forth. But the S and the G part, I think, is more about culture. In fact, it is all about culture. When you talk about governance and when you talk about board governance, I would argue that before it gets to the point of board governance, what's the culture that there is in the organization to look at matters connected with S and with G? And that's really crucial. In my experience, Amit, and we've just stood up a new manufacturing facility, invested about $1 billion, that's employing about 20,000 people all over the last 18 months. The only reason where we are, and supplying into a global supply chain, where we stand out versus other competing geographies is because of the focus on S, nothing else. And their point is, I think you in India and maybe US starters know how to respect people and how to treat people, and therefore, it is you who that we would like to work with. And I think therefore that gets to be an important element in terms of moving ahead. The other point that you made about, is it the management's responsibility, groups, etc. I think the tone certainly has to be set from the top. As I said, we set the tone from the top to say we have to use this as a competitive advantage. Second, I don't think one can be incremental about it. One just has to go all in. So let me give you a few examples. In Tata Motors, say about 3 or 4 years ago, when I think it was decided that they will go embrace electric vehicles completely. At that time, mind you, it wasn't very clear that this is what will succeed, will not succeed. It was a bold bet. But yes, it was all in, and you go down there. Or for JLR to say we will only produce electric vehicles beyond a certain point, and so on and so forth. Or for Tata Steel to go out there and say that by so and so year, this is where we will be. Or for Tata Power to say, I will not add, so these are very definitive positions that are taken by the company, and the message therefore gets to be loud and clear. So I think it is important for the tone to be set right from the top. And once I think that tone and the direction is set, it's of course the details and everything else has to be worked out then by the companies to see how do you actually execute on that tone. And mind you, in our context, these are separate listed companies. So, there is a discussion in the boards of those separate listed companies as well. But they realize that, maybe the single largest shareholder is kind of saying that, look here, we want to be committed to this. We are willing to stay the long course. And therefore, it is something that we would very heartily support. So that's the way I think we are going about it, Amit.
Thank you. Tahir, let me kind of come to you with a question, which is, if you kind of look at the global market and you look at the Indian market, globally you find that, the assets under management with tracking ESG or sustainability is a relatively large corpus which is doing so. In India, it's relatively small. What do you attribute this difference in the size? And, it's not kind of grown exponentially as one would expect it to. So what is your understanding of this? Is it the issue in terms of getting data from companies, or is it because more companies, more investors are saying that, look, we need to embrace it wholeheartedly rather than have it in pockets within the firm?
I think it is a more, a question of evolution, and our markets have, not evolved to that extent, I would say, as let's say the recognition which is set in global markets in terms of, sensitivities around ESG. So I think it's a matter of time. I think data is an unavailability of data, of course, is an issue, but that is secondary. I don't really think that is it's something which will also change over a period of time. But I think it is more about mindset. It's more about where we are in our overall evolution journey. I think increasingly as we are getting integrated with the globe on several aspects, whether it is technology or whether it is global markets or access to global markets or access to global funds. The relevance is only increasing. So that's why, as I said, that even if some part of corporate India is behind the curve for any reason with regard to ESG, or probably if there are managements who believe that in India, and there are investors also who in India who think that probably ESG is too early for being embraced by Indian investors. And India can have will have enough time on its hand to actually comply with global regulations, etc. I don't really think we can sit in that comfort. We will have to expedite and accelerate things from here on, because, like as I said, you don't have a choice. If you're looking as a country, if you're looking for global flows, global capital to grow yourself, to support your economy, I think you don't have a choice but to fall in line, even at a slower pace, to the requirements of the global investors. So there are global investors who will, in any case, start punishing companies or corporates or valuations of companies, irrespective of whether we like it or not. So I think we don't really have a choice but to come up the curve in that regard. Yes, data is an issue, but I think that also, incrementally we should get better. Hopefully, over the next couple of years, as we know, corporates will be called upon to adopt the new disclosure standards. The BRSR is on its way. It's a lot more transparent. It's a lot more granular in terms of what it seeks with regard to a disclosure of data. I think companies and their boards will have no choice but to gear up for those reporting standards. New metrics and standards are evolving, and they are important as well because it will lead to some kind of standardization too. So I think there is a fair bit of work which is on the anvil, and as in many other things, I think the pace at which India will probably move, I'm pretty confident. We will leapfrog as we do in most other things. We will come up to those standards in a relatively shorter period of time than probably many of the other countries have done at the same time of their life cycle.
Thank you. Thank you. There's a question from the audience. Kalpana, maybe I directed that towards you. I'll read the question out and then I have some comments on it and then hand it over to you, which is on the key man risk. What do boards do to address this risk, especially in the context of family-owned companies? My comment here is that, you know, families generally have a better way of managing it. So one, I'd like to have your thoughts on that. But increasingly, what we find is one is key man risk. The other is you've got very powerful CEOs where people in the board kind of tend to tiptoe around rather than have a more constructive dialogue with them. So if you look at some of the board failures which we saw, whether it is IiAS or Yes Bank, that was an issue. If you kind of look at the NSE saga, which is playing out, again, it seems to be an issue. Do you have some thoughts on this? One is, who's managing succession planning better? Is it the, you know, or are anyone managing it better, the family or the professionals? And the second is the very powerful CEOs. How do you think the boards can equip themselves to deal with someone who is larger than life, has tremendous experience, grip on the business, and therefore the boards find very difficult to challenge on an operational basis?
So I'll take the first question, Amit. I think it's a core responsibility of the Nomination and Compensation Committee. And succession planning is the heart of what they're required to do, not just merely look at new director selection and director evaluation, but succession planning, not just for the CEO, but for the senior management team is a core part of it. And certainly on the boards that I sit, it is very much a core agenda of the Nom and Nom-Com committees. Once a year, you actually go down for even one level below the management committees in terms to evaluate the bench strength that is available. All of us are human. We can drop dead anytime. And therefore, there has to be a very rigorous succession planning, not just for the CEO, but certainly the management committee below, as well as boards themselves. I know people will argue that independent directors are far more dispensable and therefore you really don't need that rigorous exercise for that. But I think it's very important as you think about board refresh, particularly with term limits now, to have as much focus on this. On your question of larger than life CEOs, you tend to see that certainly in family controlled companies, but you tend to see that a lot also in very widely held professionally managed companies as well. And there, I think it is a collective responsibility of the board, unless, you know, you've really stuffed the board with your cronies who are not going to challenge you. But I'm sure the investors like Tahir, when they are casting the vote for those independent directors, will certainly have their voice heard. But if you do have an active independent board, then the collective might of the board, there is no way, however godlike the CEO might believe he is, that you would not be able to challenge him effectively. And I know the examples that you talked about are the ones that get debated and discussed much more. But if you really dig deep into it, you will find indeed that pretty strong CEOs have been effectively challenged by a strong board and have significantly had to change their plans or the initial compensation that they thought they and their management teams required. So it all boils down to governance at the end of the day.
Sure, sure. Banbali, do you want to weigh in on that?
Well, I think she's, Ms. Morpade, I think she's explained it really well. Just a couple of points over here, Amit, which is, yes, I mean, if you're looking at things like compensation and things like that, I think you're spot on. But think of a large, widespread conglomerate. And one is a CEO of that conglomerate for a fairly longish period, something like a GE and so on. And I would maybe just take a step back and wonder, no matter, I mean, you attend a board meeting once a quarter. How does the board member understand what really the business of the company is and how is it doing? How do you understand the nuances and the complexity of that business? I would argue that it's very difficult to do so. And I guess the point I'm making is that at the end of the day, I think you've got to have that CEO who is, dependable, who's putting up facts, etc., that are supposed to be put up. And I think the point that was made earlier about the culture and the governance that there is in terms of being open and transparent and so on. The point I'm making is that there is a limit to which I think the board, especially for a large and complex setup, will be able to capture whatever is going on as far as management or the CEO is concerned. It would be very difficult. That would be my point. I understand that this may be slightly different school of thought, but that's how I feel. And including, I mean, you have the famous discussion around, separating the positions of the chairman and CEO, etc. And I remember having discussed that briefly with Jeff, and he said, who was at that time the chairman and CEO of GE, and he said, yeah, you can bring in a chairman of GE. What will he understand or what I do? And I'm not saying it in a flippant way, but truly, I mean, it's a very complex setup. So I think it's a tough one. And again, I want to repeat that it boils down to the culture, and maybe to a discussion on even the tenure that a CEO should have, so that you just don't keep on getting more and more years of the same person. Yeah.
Yeah. No, you're absolutely right. I think there is something to be said about extended CEO tenure. I know RBI has brought in some guidelines to that effect, but it's easier to do it in a business which is as heavily regulated as a bank is. It's less difficult to do it in some of the other sectors. So hopefully those checks and balances would be provided by the investors as they vote on some of the resolutions and as they kind of engage with companies and talk about how they visualize things to unfold. But Mali, since I have you there, let me ask you one other question. How do you think, you did mention about, you gave the example of Tata Motors going all in, Tata Steel having different people coming in and talking about ESG and the risks and what matters to the board at frequent intervals. But that doesn't necessarily all get communicated to the investors. So how do you think companies should communicate their progress to investors? Is it just a reporting of numbers? Is it that, talking about at the AGM? Is there some other more efficient or effective way of doing that? Your thoughts?
Yeah, and I think, that's a function of what's the temperament of the organization, meaning, would you like to talk first and do later? If you know what I mean, do you go tom-tomming about even the smallest of things, or are you a little more conservative in the way you communicate things? I think it is, so that kind of temperament does come into play. I think it's also a question of how regularly do you kind of engage with the investor community at large, so that they understand what you're doing, how you're doing, and so on and so forth. And lastly, I think it's also to do with the length at which an investor would kind of stay on in the organization to truly understand the ethos, the plans, etc., of a company, and kind of see them through, versus having a very short-term view and short-term approach. And I think that is also something which is something to be studied and debated. Meaning that if the investments are purely with a view to an exit, what does it do to the way you run a company? What does it do to the way you frame your policies and so on and so forth? So I think it's a combination of all these things, and I think as again the confidence and the trust element between the company and the investors, etc., builds up, I'm sure these things get better over time.
Thank you. That is, you're absolutely right. It depends a lot on the DNA of the company, how open are they, and then how they wish to communicate it. Tahir, with that, let me come to you. There's a question from the audience, which is, the future of certain industries, which do, again, employ a lot of people, contribute a lot as taxes, but you've got swathes of the economy dependent on it. One of the things we can talk about is the the power energy sector or the coal sector, with whichever way you look at it, which has suddenly gone out of favor. So how are you thinking about that? And in this context, I just want to kind of draw the example of what had happened in ExxonMobil, where you had an investor who kind of engaged with the company. But their engagement was to say that, look, your strategy needs to kind of change very dramatically. And they kind of said that, okay, we'll bring in some people who kind of understand how the strategy needs to change. Do you see Indian companies, one is, how are you as an investor looking at some of these industries? And B, as an investor, do you think the Indian market is ready for a more engaged role, at least as far as ESG is concerned, which is something which matters to society more broadly rather than them as a few people, as was the case earlier?
I would react by saying that, look, some of these companies, which obviously as a starting point probably are looking challenged, whether it is commodity companies, manufacturing companies. Coal is a prime example of that, as you said. And yeah, we have to be we have to be logical about it. I mean, we know that it's not going to disappear overnight. This is not something that we can do without. Even while there might be some of these companies which are actually trying to gradually change track and balance their businesses by having probably some of the old gen businesses versus some of the more renewable businesses which are being added to the portfolio, so as to probably be able to bring in what is, let's say, known as a carbon balance, so to speak, in their respective line of business. So I think we are open to that as investors. I think, as I said, it's not about static ESG at a point in time. We want to see evolution of those businesses. There are some companies which might be in some of the typical polluting industries, but are they changing? Are they changing to adopt or embrace more of technology? We've known of let's say companies which are even in steel, for example. I mean, if you do a simple thing like probably building a conveyor belt to probably transport iron ore from one place to another, it is probably going to cut back on pollution and bring down transportation costs in the bargain. So are companies involved in doing that? Are they trying to rebalance their portfolios with respect to conventional versus non-conventional? So there are various things which businesses today can do in order to mitigate some of the generic problems that their industries are dealing with, and that is what I think investors are reasonably conscious of. That there are let's say automobile manufacturers who have no choice but to balance their businesses with ICE related vehicles, and also contribute to the whole non-ICE ecosystem, whether it is CNG or whether it is electric vehicles. And at some level, we all have to understand that it is only these companies and these businesses which will probably be able to effectively do that. There will be new players on the block, but the kind of resources which will be called on at the end of a new company to start a completely new ecosystem will be of a completely different order versus businesses and balance sheets which are a lot more stronger and will be the best placed in order to be able to make that transition. So I don't think investors can easily dump those businesses or those companies and entirely move and gravitate towards the new emerging entities. I think we have to take a balanced view of things, and these are things, like as I said, will evolve over a period of time, and so there will be a transition path, and we all probably can be a part of that transition.
Thank you. That with that, but do you want to come in? And in that context, I just want to ask you, India does have a commitment to net zero, but do you think we are kind of not being aggressive enough given the seriousness of the challenges which are in front of us? Or do you think this is just the right amount of time we've given ourselves to move to net zero?
Yeah. No, I think we are being pretty practical about it. I think if you see the kind of steps and the direction that the government policies have taken, I would say that they are a tad aggressive, meaning, they are more aggressive than what otherwise maybe one would have expected, which is good. And I think it certainly spells out the right tone as far as the country is going. So I would argue that I think we are going down just the right path. I think we also need to understand that we are trying to embrace more and more manufacturing, trying to take in businesses from other places. This will put pressure, and I think we need to understand that. For example, setting up a semiconductor chip fabrication unit, in many ways, you could argue is how is that different from a coal-based plant, just given the amount of water that it would consume or the amount of power that it would consume and so on and so forth. So we just need to understand a few of the ground realities. But I would argue on the balance, Amit, the path that the country has chosen is indeed aggressive, and it just seems right.
Thanks a lot. I think we are kind of running out of time. So, Kalpana, let me kind of turn to you, something which we at IiAS have been working for a while now, which is gender diversity. And recently we did some work with, or we kind of were associated with a project which IIM Ahmedabad has been doing, which is again on gender. And what they find is that the number of women who are just outside the corner office is, you've got, our data shows you've got about 17% independent women directors on boards. But then when you look at a lot of companies, you've got even less women who are there in senior management roles. So you did speak about succession planning and looking at one step beyond. So do you want to just comment on it, and what do you think companies can be doing to step up more women participation at more senior management levels? And I know you were a part of the senior leadership team at ICICI when there were a lot of women who then went on to head a lot of other organizations. Do you want to talk about your experience there and what you were doing and what lessons that holds for other firms?
Amit, the answer to that would have taken me 1 hour to explain. So it's really a challenge you've thrown at me to do it in exactly 2 minutes. But I think there is an increasing amount of focus, certainly at the board level, more particularly in the NomCom committees, in terms of tracking gender matrices across the board, where not just at the senior level, but also at the mid-level. Because if you don't have that bench, obviously you don't have a pool from where women will graduate to the senior management team and then eventually to the corner office. I find, and this is more particularly in the context of the service industry rather than the manufacturing sector, that if you look at entry level, it's not as badly skewed. You might get a 40-60, you might get a 38 odd percentage of women coming in. I think there is a significant leak at the middle level, and therefore you see a much smaller proportion at the senior level. And I think this is where companies, certainly the board committees, the HR and the CEO and his team have to be very focused in terms of what are the HR practices and processes that you're bringing in to ensure that you're hand-holding women at critical junctures of their life, childbearing and the child-rearing age. And what are the facilitated policies that you have? What are the forums that you've created within the company where these women are handheld and not treated as pariah merely because she says that she's going to have a baby? Oh my God, now what's going to happen over the next 6 and 8 months? But rather be with her through that entire journey. And I found in my experience, several women actually wanting to stay engaged even when they are on their 6-month maternity leave. And what is it that the companies can do to keep them very much engaged with the company, even when they've taken this sabbatical, such that when they come back into the workforce, it's as though they've just not had that break. So I think there is a greater and greater responsibility on the part of the companies to create that, and certainly, of course, for the individuals themselves to ensure that within this facilitative environment, what is it that they are doing to ensure that they just don't drop off the workplace? Because any company that has a decent number of mid-level and senior level women actually acts as a magnet in attracting more and more women.
I think that's that's well captured. That if you have women in senior leadership roles, they will be able to attract more and more women in that. I think that's just what we have time for. So with that, let me bring this session to an end. I'd like to thank all the three panelists. Your insights have been very valuable, and thank you for sharing it with a wider audience. And with that, let's bring the event today to a close. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. And we're going to shortly have the report as well as Hital's presentation on our website. So those of you who want to kind of read it, look at it for some of the nuances, try and look at it for some of the trends, I'd encourage you to do so. With that, thank you all very well. Thank you all very much. And yeah, we hope to hear from you all soon. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Amit. Thank you very much. Thanks. Bye.